Today we are looking at the sin-based response to the divine hiddenness problem. I'm responding to a video by the channel Christian Philosophy Academy with guest Dr. Max Baker-Hytch, lecturer at Oxford University, who is discussing an open access paper he wrote entitled On Sin-Based Responses to Divine Hiddenness. A link to his paper is in both the description and the original video. I have no degree in philosophy and don't claim to fully grasp the different models and dilemmas proposed, but the issue of divine hiddenness is near and dear to my heart, as it was the prime mover, so to speak, to the deconstruction of my faith. I have no intention of trying to school this learned young man in philosophy. I'm sure he knows far more than I do on the topic. However, I do think his religious beliefs have given him and our host tunnel vision on the issue at hand. This is the basis of my response. Let's have a chat. Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining me, and especially to my patrons and channel members. Thank you all for the algorithm boost on my last video. Y'all really helped. The video I'm responding to is over an hour long, so I will only address segments, and there will likely be a part 2. We pick up where our host has asked Dr. Baker-Hytch for an overview of the issue.
Schellenberg's argument can be boiled down to a deductive argument with two premises, really. One of which says if a perfectly loving God exists, then no one fails to believe in God unless it's their fault. There are no non-resistant non-believers. And then the second premise says, but there are some non-resistant non-believers. And so that leads to the atheistic conclusion. And it's very clear that by far the majority of responders to Schellenberg attack the first premise. And in some cases, people will remark on the option of attacking the second premise, which says that there are non-resistant non-believers. So to attack it would be to deny that there are any non-resistant non-believers.
Apologia responded to this very point 4 years ago. However, since, like me, Apologia is not in the academic world of philosophy, I can see why Dr. Baker-Hytch wouldn't be familiar with his work. Apologia was responding to inspiring philosophy. So while this may not be discussed much in academic circles, it certainly is making the rounds among us armchair philosophers.
And that's what you could call a sin-based response, because it's saying basically that the reason for the failure of some people in this world to believe in God is due to sin.
And already I arrive at my major problem with I'm going to use Dr. Baker from here on out for brevity's sake, with Dr. Baker's approach. While Dr. Baker doesn't claim here or in his paper to be defending a particular God, he is assuming his God is being the only God under consideration. For there to be a sin response, first sin must exist. Unfortunately, Dr. Baker hasn't defined sin, so I'm going to go with my own definition of an offense against God or a law of God. If a God exists that doesn't care if humans believe in it or not, then non-belief would not be a sin, unless this God expressly forbade non-belief. But what would be the sense of that? If the God didn't care if humans believe in it, forbidding non-belief would be pointless. Thus, as to a God that doesn't care if humans believe in it, there can be no sin-based reason for non-belief, as non-belief itself is not a sin, nor is belief a goal of this God. So to even make the claim that failure to believe in God is due to sin, one must assume that God cares about belief and that the God cares sufficiently that this God has declared unbelief to be a sin, or at least held this to be a sin, even if he has made no such declaration. One cannot sin by unbelief if unbelief isn't a sin. What I don't know is whether Dr. Baker intends his argument to apply only to his particular God, or if he has assumed that his God is the only possible God. The point is, it seems that Dr. Baker's argument only works if you presuppose his version of God. Yet he's given us no reason why we should do that.
But I more just wanted it to have more airtime and to be thought through more carefully.
Cool. I'm glad Dr. Baker approves of my going through his argument and giving it some thought and discussion.
When you say sin-based response, can you define for us or just give us a rough sketch? What are we talking about when we're talking about sin? I know there's different accounts of sin, but kind of just generally, how are you thinking of sin?
Oh, my bad. He just hadn't gotten to the definition yet.
Basically, disordered desires or disordered loves. So that, basically a person loves the wrong things. They in effect treat something that is penultimate as ultimate.
Okay, I have never heard of that definition of sin before. So sin is loving the wrong thing or having the wrong priorities.
Now, if you two don't mind, I'm going to bed before either of you come up with another clever idea to get us killed, or worse, expelled.
She needs to sort out her priorities.
So according to Ron, Hermione was a sinner. Dr. Baker even lists making the penultimate, the ultimate, as being a sin. So it is even sin to consider what is second best to be best. In whose opinion? Since we're talking about God, it would seem God's opinion. In Dr. Baker's opinion, it is sin not only to not believe, but to believe in God but not consider God to be the best. It's not only essential to believe in God, but also to believe in God in the right way. This gets us to Pelagia's category of the unsaved believer.
Everyone who is saved must start with basic theism, the acknowledgement that a God exists. But it's that plus this filial knowledge, the lordship aspect. I know there's dispute among Christians about exactly what this differentiating factor is, but suffice to say we can divide the believers in God into two groups, the saved believers and the unsaved believers. So I think we've set the table enough now to proceed. All humans fall into one of these four categories: a saved believer, an unsaved believer, a reasonable non-believer, or an unreasonable non-believer.
I seriously doubt Dr. Baker would say sinners are saved, so I think it's safe to say that the believer with incorrect priorities is still a sinner and is unsaved. But how far does this go? If the believer doesn't think God the ultimate greatness of the universe, I think it's safe to say that Dr. Baker would call this person a sinner. But what about a person who disagrees with Dr. Baker on a minor point of theology? Is that person a sinner for not having the correct priorities? I think Dr. Baker would say no. It matters if they disagree with God on God's priorities. However, if this is his position, and please, Dr. Baker, if I'm misrepresenting your position, let me know. Is there anyone who knows all of God's priorities? Is there even a single person who knows all of what God's desires are and is in perfect alignment with God's desires? If not, then there is no one without sin. And again, correct me if I am wrong, Dr. Baker, but most Christians agree that there is no one without sin, as that is in the Bible. And thus, if sin is what prevents one from seeing God clearly, is this not equally an issue for the believer as it is for the unbeliever? If not having all of one's priorities in line with God's makes one an unbeliever, and no one is in perfect alignment with God, therefore there is no such thing as a believer? What do you know? Vice Rhino was even more right than he realized.
They can all use Bible verses to back up their positions. So how did the non-Christians figure out which Christians are actually reflecting God's morality and which are reflecting the fallen, sinful morality? They cannot all be right. Ideally, the way we would tell them apart is if God were to actually come down here and clarify his position for himself. But he seems to be in the middle of being the hide-and-seek champion of the universe.
Not only is God the hide-and-seek champion of the universe, even people who claim to be believers can't find him, as he has hidden himself from all of humanity. Will you make a case for there being no such thing as a believer? Let us see.
He thinks that we fail to love the real ultimate reality, which is God.
So the sinner is the one that fails to love first and foremost the real ultimate reality, which you claim is God. I don't expect you to support that claim, as that isn't the topic of discussion. However, if I were in this conversation, that is exactly what I would ask. My question to Dr. Baker would be, does that not describe everyone? Does not even the most devout believer fail at some point in their life to make God first and foremost? What does that even mean? Is it sin for a person to stop thinking about God and make work a priority during work hours? Is it sin to put one's family first when dealing with a family crisis?
And we substitute something in the place of God and love that thing as if it were ultimate. But then we deceive ourselves and lead ourselves to believe that that's not what's going on.
Good clarification. So if you love your child and stop thinking about God to handle a problem for your child, it isn't sin as long as you still think God is the ultimate somewhere in the back of your mind. But is merely thinking that God is ultimate enough? Does it matter which God you think is the ultimate? If I think Zeus is the ultimate God, am I good? Clearly, that doesn't make me a believer in Christianity. But if no God has revealed himself to me, and based on what I can garner from looking at the sky or from what my culture has taught me, I conclude that Zeus is the ultimate God, am I then not a believer as I have a belief in an ultimate? If I have a duty to believe in a particular God, in a particular ultimate, then it seems to me that I would be unable to fulfill that duty unless that particular God sufficiently revealed that to me. If anything, I think you've made the divine hiddenness problem even greater.
I've definitely experienced that in my life.
Interesting. Our host, Christopher Kloos, forgive me if I mispronounce that, admits he falls into the sinner category by this definition from time to time. Does this cause him to waver from being a believer to being an unbeliever from time to time? I doubt that, but it could make him an unsaved believer, depending on your definition of what it means to be saved. Will that be relevant?
It's sounds a lot like also making an idol of something and then tricking yourself into thinking that thing, you're not making an idol of that thing.
Is tricking yourself a deliberate act? If not, you are not tricking yourself. You merely misremember. But if you are, in fact, intentionally deceiving yourself, then you fell for your own trick. Is that even possible? It would be like a magician forgetting how his own trick works and thinking it was actual magic.
When did you realize that you have magic powers?
And while our host confesses that he has done this, he doesn't specify if he has intentionally deceived himself, if that is even possible, or if he has merely gotten confused on what his priorities are, which makes sense as that is a common human condition. I am going with the latter as the former defies logic. If a loving God sees his child, whom he loves, getting his priorities mixed up, and failure to fix this would result in eternal consequences, as in literal hell, would it not behoove the God to intervene, especially considering this person is a believer and is open to such correction? Yet time and again this God fails to do that. The result is believers, such as myself, are becoming unbelievers in droves. Does your God not care? Does he care but not enough to do anything about it? Is this not the crux of the divine hiddenness problem?
I agree, and that's why I don't commit myself to that, what I call a universal sin-based response.
This was Dr. Baker's answer to a question about making the case for the non-existence of the non-resistant non-believer. So let's see how he does make his case.
Sin-based responses can still have value even if they don't offer a universal sin-based response, being the claim that every non-believer is in a state of non-belief due to their own sin. So I'm not personally committed to endorsing that claim.
Cool. I don't think it possible to support such a claim. Glad I don't need to demonstrate why.
Whereas Schellenberg's argument is deductive, which is to say that he claims to have some premises which, if they're all true, guarantee that atheism is the case. Whereas what Marsh and Mason are saying is there's some facts in the world. They're not going to claim that they are strictly incompatible with God existing, but what they're going to claim is that these facts are more strongly predicted by atheism than by theism. And the facts in question are, well, for Mason, the uneven distribution of theistic belief throughout human history and geography. So basically, he's thinking that theistic belief seems to be more heavily concentrated in certain cultures at certain times in human history.
If there is a particular God that wants humans to have knowledge of it, it would seem the burden would be on the God to disseminate that knowledge, particularly given the disparity of power and ability between humans and gods.
Jason Marsh is basically using the same framework that I just described in terms of some facts which are allegedly more strongly expected on atheism than on theism, but he's going to focus on the alleged fact, and I say alleged because some people have challenged it as an empirical claim, but the alleged fact that early humans, pre-axial humans, that's to say before the emergence of the major religions, the Abrahamic religions, Hinduism, Buddhism, and so on. Humans living before that era were in a position where they didn't have a concept of a monotheistic God.
Did Neanderthals or Denisovans have any ideas of gods at all, monotheistic or not? What are you defining as human? Anyone in the genus Homo? Homo habilis? If your definition only includes Homo sapiens, did early Homo sapiens have ideas about gods? I seriously doubt that the idea of God was birthed with the first Homo sapien. Rather, it was more likely developed by adult Homo sapiens to explain the unexplainable to others. Regardless of how ideas of gods first came about, your religion doesn't have God revealing himself to humans at all before Moses, which would be somewhere around 3,400 years ago. Unless you count the Adam and Eve stories, which really are hard to fit into your theology at this point. So you have the problem of there not being any claim of any God revealing itself to humans until after they had been around for about 180 millennia. And while most humans ever to have existed at all have existed in the last 3 millennia, from a time perspective, gods have only been known to humans for a very short portion of their existence. Gods are new kids on the block. Dr. Baker summarizes existing scholarship in the sin-based camps as falling into 3 categories. The first describes a sin-based reasoning for divine hiddenness without making an argument. The second makes the argument that if a person is unresistant to a god, that person would seek God rather than settle for atheism or agnosticism. I would then ask if that holds to all things or only to gods. In other words, to borrow Paulogia's analogy, I am not resistant to the idea of intelligent life on other planets. Does that mean I have a responsibility or even a desire to find out? No, it doesn't. I am a non-resistant non-believer to the existence of life on other planets, yet I am doing nothing about that non-resistant non-belief. Why would I think it should be different from any other non-resistant non-belief, such as the non-resistant non-belief in gods? But since that isn't the argument Dr. Baker intends to make, we'll set that aside.
The idea is if they cared sufficiently about finding out the truth, they would never reach the place that Schellenberg thinks one can rationally reach, where you conclude that there's no God.
Is it that they don't care or they can't? If there is a God, I have no idea how to go about finding it. If the answer is listen to those who claim to have found that God, I did that. I did that for 42 years, and they are so hopelessly incongruent with one another that I landed at atheism. My atheism isn't a lack of trying to find God.
And then the third camp, I talked about Mark Talbot. So he points to an interesting consideration, which is that people who convert from atheism or agnosticism to theism will quite often say that on reflection, looking back at their past selves, that they think now, from their current vantage point as theists, they think that when they were non-theists, they were culpable. That they had enough evidence, or at least that the evidence that they had in front of them was not such as to license just a contented state of non-belief.
So the third camp would simply deny my existence, and the existence of many of my friends. Lovely. Do they not think that at some point one must admit defeat? If one tries for 42 years to find a God and cannot do so, is it not time to say, I cannot find any God? Would it not be insanity at this point to continue to try the same things over and over again when they continually fail? And what is it I'm supposed to be looking for? I know, a God, but how does one know when one has found a God? Does it have to be a particular God? And if so, how does one know when one found the right God? I know you think you have found the right God, but why? What is it that you found that assures you that yours is the right one?
I thought this was an interesting point anyway. He offers a range of real life cases where a person or group of people fail to believe that God exists despite what they consider to be a miracle having occurred.
They being the researchers or the test subjects. Even if it is the test subjects, why does a miraculous occurrence require a divine agent? A person falling from a 10-story building and surviving is miraculous, but it doesn't require a divine agent. It happens so rarely we consider it to be miraculous, but it does happen. Incidentally, they was the test subjects. The paper is not open access, but the answer to that question is in the abstract.
And I often hear that from atheists, what would it take for you to become a theist? And their response often is, well, a religious experience. And that's a really interesting point that he's citing some real life cases where you have a miracle and yet there's still resistance or some inability to take on board the evidence before you as it really is in terms of its weight.
Is it really an inability to take on board the evidence in terms of the weight, or is it the evidence just wasn't convincing to that person? As I pointed out in my video, The Great Clarinet Teacher, if a God wants me to be convinced of his or her existence, this God needs to provide evidence that is convincing to me. Not to Christopher here or to Dr. Baker, but to me. That you would be convinced by something doesn't mean that I would be. To claim that something was convincing to you, and therefore I must be convinced, is to not know how arguments work, at least not in the colloquial or legal sense, not necessarily in the philosophical sense. As a retired attorney, if I had ever complained to a judge that a jury had to find for my client because I put on evidence that was convincing to my office staff, thus the evidence was convincing, and the jury had to find for me, I would be laughed out of the courtroom. That the people surveyed by O'Connell didn't believe in a God despite seeing what they considered a miraculous event doesn't mean that they are resistant to the idea of a God. It means that the evidence that was presented to them was unconvincing to them. And if there is a God that wants them to believe in it, it needs to do better. And if that God is an all-knowing God, that God would have known even before performing the miracle that it would not be convincing, and doing the miracle for them would be an exercise in futility. Worse, it knew that it was futile, but did it anyway. What do you call someone who knows that something won't work but does it anyway? How about an idiot?
Yeah.
Glad you agree. Just kidding, by the way. I was just amused by the fact that when I finished writing that last sentence, then letting the video go, that was the first thing he said.
So to my mind, that suggests there's in the background, like you said, disordered desires, some kind of desire to not believe in God. And so maybe that account is sort of ferreting out the fact that there is this desire that is preventing you from seeing the evidence for what it is, and then updating your beliefs.
What makes you think a person that isn't convinced by what you find convincing has a desire not to believe? Why is it so hard to accept that they just don't see the evidence the same way you do? Let's put it this way. Do you believe in magic? Not the kind your God allegedly does, but humans performing magic. I don't, and I'm guessing you don't either. When I watch a magician on stage, I know that he or she is performing a trick. I may not know how the trick is done, but I still know that it's a trick. And yet, there are adults that believe in magic.
When did you realize that you have magic powers?
They will look at the same magician and think that they are doing real magic. Does that mean that they did real magic and I just don't want the magic to be real? Have you ever considered the possibility that the shoe is on the other foot? Could it be that the evidence of your God's non-existence is plain to see, but your desire for it to be true drives you to believe because you are a resistant believer?
Yep.
Thank you. Sorry, I couldn't resist that happened twice in one video. Dr. Baker then discusses 3 objections to these views. While he is talking about the objections to a view that he doesn't hold, he does occasionally slip in the effect that these would have on the sin-based model that he argues for. So he does get into some of his own argument here. Christopher spends 5 minutes to ask about people before monotheism was discovered. They limit the time covered to recorded history, so there aren't 15 millennia to deal with. Christopher concludes that one can't be resistant to an idea that man has yet to discover. Before we get to Dr. Baker's answer, I think the question answers itself in the way that I have phrased it. Man discovers monotheism. A God doesn't reveal it to man. Zoroastrianism was likely the first monotheistic religion, and it influenced Judaism and Christianity. If the Abrahamic God were real, why did it wait for man to come up with monotheism before presenting any evidence for its existence? Here's how Dr. Baker sees it.
The hiddenness argument defenders, people like Schellenberg, Mates, and Marsh, they might grant what you've just said, but I suppose what they'd want to say is, well, yes, fine, but the sin-based response needs us to be able to say that they are resistant non-believers, and that's equally a sort of misapplication of the concept. Okay, even if we can't say they're non-resistant non-believers, nor can we say that they are resistant non-believers. But that's what the sin-based account wants to be able to say.
If they would draw a distinction between sin that is sort of out of our DNA, inherited, so to speak, just sort of like part of who we are,
yes,
so that it would make sense that people are just sinful, from the beginning, and then you'd say, but this other thing is cognition, and there we're trying to apply a concept to cognition that we can't really meaningfully apply. We can apply sin to these people because they have a sin nature.
Question to both of you. Where does this sin nature come from? Christopher says it's in our DNA. In your religion, in your belief system, isn't your God the one that determines what DNA a person gets? Isn't it your God that determined that a sin nature would be passed down to all of humanity? How does that even work? Where did this sin nature even come from? Did Neanderthals have a sin nature? Homo habilis? If it's supposed to come from a fall from Adam and Eve, where do they fit into the picture? Did they come around the time that man discovers monotheism? Is that why you give prehistoric man a pass, as he didn't get a sin nature? Since there is nothing in the study of DNA to suggest that it contains a sin nature, where do you even get this idea from? It's your religion, isn't it? This is part of your theology. If you have to presuppose your theology, including your theology on a sin nature, in order to arrive at a position where you can make the argument that there is a sin-based response to divine hiddenness, have you not just presupposed away the problem? If the whole point is to prove that your God can exist, even though the evidence for your God is so lacking in this world, where your God allegedly wants people to know him, if you have to presuppose your theology to be correct to even make the argument, what's the point? Why not just declare that you have presupposed your God, and that's all there is to it?
But if you want to apply non-resistant to their cognition, and it's not even possible that they possess the concept, then you might go ought implies can. Like if it's the case that they can, or ought to find God or ought to believe in God, then it must be the case that they can, but they can't. Therefore, it's not the case they ought to. So you might push back and say, like, invoke an ought implies can principle and say, but they do have that sin nature.
Have you not just done the same thing again? You have presupposed that there is a moral obligation to believe in God, and now you claim that because an ought implies can, that therefore man must be capable of belief in a monotheistic God before there being evidence of such a belief, because you have presupposed a duty to believe in this God as an argument for the existence of this God. That got a bit convoluted. If the whole point is to argue that your God can exist, don't you think it a problem for your argument if you have to presuppose your theology in order to make the argument? If we don't presuppose your theology, there is no moral obligation to believe in your God, or any God.
And something else that we've not yet talked about is that you could split apart sin in the sense of original sin, that which is to say a kind of disposition that, according to Orthodox Christianity, all human beings are born with, this disposition of will. You could split that apart from moral culpability, which is a move that some theologians and philosophers have made. And so, in other words, you could say, yeah, it is due to their sinful nature that they are in this state of non-belief, but it's not their fault, and they're not culpable for that.
This response is far more reasonable. If a man isn't culpable for understanding a God that hasn't given man or allowed man to discover or waited for man to discover monotheism, doesn't hold man responsible for knowing what he cannot or does not know, thus there is no moral obligation here.
I've just had that question, and I'm still not settled on it. And I think there's actually worries with regard to the notion of self-deception that's at play, specifically in Schellenberg's articulation of the argument, because he doesn't really explain self-deception.
Well, that explains it. I mean, is it really possible to deceive yourself? I do think it is, but not intentionally. Like the example I gave in another video of my grandfather telling the story of my aunt falling through the ice and being rescued, but later in life he became the rescuer. He really remembered the event that way later in life. He was deceived. The deception came from his own brain. But it wasn't deliberate. It was his mind wanting to see himself as the hero. If humans are deceived into thinking there is no God, but not deliberately, then to hold them accountable for an action that they didn't choose is unjust. Worse, this God gave them the mind that would cause such a deception, and then the only one culpable is the God that made this person this way. Unless the God is also deceived, which doesn't fit your theology, so I imagine you wouldn't consider that possibility.
When you go into it, when you drill into it, especially with the literature on self-deception, it gets really murky and unclear that it's working. So, and I think that might apply to what I was just saying about non-belief, because a non-believer, non-resistant non-believer is just not resistant.
Christopher has a point. What is resistance or non-resistance? If a person lacks evidence for a God, they aren't necessarily resistant. If they then are given some evidence but aren't convinced, does that automatically make them resistant? What if the evidence is poor evidence? What if the evidence is inconsistent with your theology? Suppose the evidence they are given is being raised in a Mormon home. They will get evidence of a monotheistic God, but the evidence won't be what you would find convincing. Suppose they are raised in a Muslim home. If you were given evidence for the Muslim God, would your rejection be resistance? Are you a resistant unbeliever to the Islamic God? How does the Muslim God feel about your resistance to him? He doesn't exist? Fine, but why do you think your God does? Why do you think one must sin to not believe in your God, but that isn't the case for other gods?
He's hanging a lot on his definition of resistance. That's really important in order to cash out what it's not in terms of non-resistance.
Cool. So you get that my point is a valid response to your argument.
And then objection B is at least no more culpable than anyone else belief. So this is just like the idea that, like, you think about a really honest and persistent and meticulous atheist who's been searching for the truth. And it just seems like if you're going to be a sin-based account proponent, you're going to want to say that they are somehow less sort of sincere or conscientious, and so therefore they're more culpable.
Why does reflective even include seeking a God? I can seek truth without seeking a God. I want to know true things, and I actively search to learn new true things. But that doesn't mean I'm searching for a God. I have no reason to search for one, as I don't even reach the level of thinking that such a search is worthwhile. But as to Dr. Baker's point, there are plenty of complacent believers, content in the theology they were raised with, never questioning whether belief in that God is even reasonable. Not that there aren't atheists and agnostics in the same boat. Sometimes the problem is not knowing what questions to ask. I frequently find myself in that position. I've been asked my worldview on morality, and I don't even know. I don't know because I don't even know what my options are. I know some options, like moral realism and anti realism, but I can't really say that I know where I fall, as I don't know what are all the possible positions. Nor do I have reason to think it matters, yet. I may soon, as I may be confronted with an argument where it matters at some point. Is there a valid reason an unbeliever should be seeking to know if there is a God? If so, what is it?
Regarding the moral and epistemic traits, like that sin-based accounts hang their hat on and say, look, these are the sort of things that are deficient in non-believers, and that's why they're resisting, because they're lacking something in terms of moral and epistemic virtue, then it looks like a weird distribution. You would be committed to or it seems problematic that there's this distribution of, according to your account, of virtues and vices that's really lopsided.
Yeah.
So, and then why think, like, I don't know, people in Thailand have just been more sort of less, careful and morally and epistemically in their investigation of God, and then that explains their non-belief. So
it's understandable that Christopher is having difficulty making this argument, as he seems to be struggling with how to not come off as racist. But it's a racist argument. Anyone that doesn't hold the same theological beliefs as I do is morally degenerate. Oh, look, the people of the world who don't agree with my theology are primarily people of color, and predominantly they're Asian. But I don't want to say that Asian people are moral degenerates. But if morals come from your God, I would have to ask why your God was so chintzy in passing out morals when it came to Asian peoples. Or on the flip side, why was your God so much more generous with the morals and non resistance to himself with white people? Is your God a white people's God? What's even more odd is if your theology were correct, it's Asian people that your God came down to when he came down in the form of an Asian person. But now your God favors white people. Why is that? Maybe it's because white people are so dumb that they need a bigger hint to get that your God is real. But reality check. The reason your theology is prevalent where it is entirely political. For about 1,000 years, Christianity was not only the predominant religion, but it was the one had to adhere to on pain of death in much of Europe. After 1,000 years of being forced to claim belief in your God, whether one actually believed it or not, it became ingrained in the culture. And where your religion didn't have the iron fist of power to force itself on people, it failed to thrive. It appears to me not that one is a moral degenerate if one doesn't adhere to your theology, but rather that holding to your theology isn't the reasonable position that you claim it to be. After all, where did your religion begin? In the Middle East, in Western Asia, and yet it didn't take hold there. And now that the British Crown no longer requires one to believe, secularism is on the rise there. The curious case is the United States. Here, Christianity has never been forced on us by the state, and yet the Christian nationalists are trying desperately to convince us that that was the case. If failing to face up to the truth makes one a moral degenerate, resistant to true belief, the Christian nationalists are the worst of the worst. And yet they hold to a form of your theology, a form close enough that you would likely accept them as fellow believers. Which takes us right back to square one. How close does one need to get to your theology to be considered a believer? What even is a believer? What does one need to believe?
Or it seems problematic that there's this distribution of, according to your account, of virtues and vices that's really lopsided.
Yeah.
So, and then why think, like, I don't know, people in Thailand have just been more sort of less, careful and morally and epistemically in their investigation of God. And
Thailand, China, India, Pakistan, North Korea, Japan, and Vietnam. Why is it so many unbelievers, like as in 2/3 of the entire population of the world, live primarily in Asia? If your God does exist, why does he hate Asian people, except South Korea and the Philippines? Evidently, he likes South Korea and the Philippines.
Yeah, the way Stephen Mason puts it is that, we expect to find variations in natural human abilities, like the ability to hear or IQ or things like that.
Excuse me? Your argument is that Asian people, except those in South Korea and the Philippines, simply lack the ability to develop the moral fiber needed to find your God? If that were true, which I wholeheartedly reject, whose fault would that be if your God is the creator God? Would this not just end up that your God created Asian people to be more resistant to belief? And if that's the way he made them, he has no one but himself to blame for them being the way he made them.
Really weird and surprising is if we found entire countries of people who are deaf, and then other entire countries of people who can hear perfectly. And he is claiming that that's what the theist or the person committed to the sin-based response to hiddenness would have to say is going on in terms of the moral and epistemic character virtues that determine whether a person ends up a theist or a non-theist.
Yeah, so that seems really counterintuitive.
Christopher, come out and say it. It's not just counterintuitive, it's racist. Is your God racist?
Because it just seems like all humans have vices and across the board. So it would be weird to be committed to saying, no, this region really has epistemic and moral vices.
Yep, that would be a weird argument to make. It would be even weirder if that was the God you believed in. But wait a minute, isn't that exactly the God you believe in? We are halfway through the video, and Dr. Baker is about to go into how he would respond to these objections. We'll save that for part 2. Can Dr. Baker dig his God out of the racist hole in which he now sits, or will his God end up buried there? Next time, we'll find out. Live your life. A fresh hot chocolate chip granny cookie for a recent super thanks goes to Christopher Knight 3737. Thank you for your support.